Kind of complicated lecture today. I want to talk about nationalism, and I do so with a skepticism that, of course, you'll quickly pick up on. Aggressive nationalism helped unleash the demons of the 20th century, beginning with World War I, which unleashed even more dangerous demons after that. So I want to talk about nationalism, and particularly in a little bit in France, but in places that one doesn't usually consider. I'll end up drawing on my friend Tim Snyder's work to talk a little bit about Lithuania and Belarus and why their nationalisms were very, very different. In the second case, didn't really exist at all in the 19th century. And I'm going to give a counterexample, which of course which I treat in the book, but of course is the Austro-Hungarian Empire. It's funny because one couldn't have imagined in the 1970s, looking nostalgically back on the Austro-Hungarian Empire, this polyglot Habsburg regime, but the horrors of the Balkans really made lots of historians and other social scientists look back and try to figure out how it was that instead of asking why it was the Austro-Hungarian Empire collapsed during World War I, or really at the end of World War I, turning the question around and saying, how did it hold together so long? So the Austro-Hungarian Empire is sort of a counterexample to these nationalisms. And of course, one of the things that brought the empire down, along with the war, was competing national claims from ethnic minorities within those vast domains. But I want to start with a story. It's something it's a book I read maybe 5 or 6 years ago, and histories have their histories, so I'm going to tell the history of this particular book, and you'll see kind of what I'm getting at. And the book, by the way, I sent out, one of you had a great idea, emailed me saying, why don't you send out the terms before the lecture? So actually, that was a great idea. I'd never thought of that, and I did it last night, though I didn't put this particular book on it. Anyway, the book is Anastasia Karakasidou, Fields of Wheat, Hills of Blood, Passages to Nationhood in Greek Macedonia, 1870-1990. And when I say that histories have their own history, what I mean is the following. In this book, this anthropologist, who is from both Turkish and Greek extraction on either side of her family, is writing a book about a small part of Macedonia. And Macedonia, of course, was heavily contested for centuries. It was in the middle, a trade route went through it. In Macedonia, there were Turks, and there were Serbs, and there were Bulgarians, and Macedonians, and Greeks. And for centuries, they'd all basically gotten along as that part of the Balkans, as you know, was under the Ottoman Empire, and then through a whole series of arrangements of wars, the Balkan Wars before World War I, passed back and forth. And essentially that is one of the points of the book, is that basically people got along very, very well, but that gradually what happened is that among competing national claims, that part of Macedonia became seen by Greeks as part of Greater Greece. Now, whenever you hear the term Greater Greece, or Greater Serbia, or Greater Germany, or Greater anything, look out. Because what that means is that in the imaginary of, in the view of nationalists, particularly aggressive nationalists, that parts of the territories that have large percentages of a certain ethnic group, or even in some cases only minorities, but in other cases majorities, should be included, come what may, in the greater state of that particular ethnic group. If you take the example of Kosovo, and Kosovo has about 85% of the population is made up of Muslims, of Albanian Muslims. And of course, Kosovo was part of Serbia, and when Milosevic was talking about Greater Serbia. It's that Greater Serbia for him could not exist unless this Kosovo, with its 85% of people who weren't Serb, was included in that. Well, anyway, that's another story. But what happened with this particular book is that when this book was in manuscript, arguing that basically the idea that Macedonia was Greek was a construction, was an invention, an invented identity by Greek nationalists, the press, the university press, I guess I shouldn't say, since this is being recorded, I shouldn't say which one that was, chickened out and decided not to publish the book. They at one point got a bomb threat saying that from Greek nationalists, saying that if you publish this book, we will blow up your offices in Europe. Bam. So they chickened out, and quite, in an example of just utter, craven cowardice, refused to publish the book. And so they sent this author, whom I don't know, I've read the book, it's a really terrific book, and said, sorry, we're not going to publish your book, too bad, contract or no contract. So the University of Chicago Press published the book, and when the book came out, this particular author received a lot of hate mail, and she received a picture of herself with a picture of a Greek flag stuck through where her heart would be. So these are fairly serious threats. So the point of that is not to jump on Greek nationalists or on Serb nationalists, so that certainly the Serb nationalists, ultranationalists, have done just an incredible amount of damage in the Balkans and over the past decades, but merely to underline the point that national identities are constructed. And one of the most useful, they're invented. They're in a way imaginary. And one of the most interesting sort of historical things you can do as a historian is to try to figure out, well, from where do these identities come? Now, language plays a lot of it. Maybe if I have time, because I've got to do a lot today, but this is more of a conversation than a lecture. If I have time, I might talk a little bit about language in the case of France. But in doing so, like most people talking about nationalism, I'm drawing on some of the thinking of Benedict Anderson and his concept of that nationalism and the construction of national self-identity represents imagined communities. Because basically, if you consider yourself a member of X nationality, you are creating links, or you're agreeing to links with people whom you don't know. People that live in Portland, Oregon, or people that live in Albuquerque, New Mexico, or people that live in New Jersey, even though we are sitting here in Connecticut. And so one of the useful aspects of Anderson's account is yet again to looking back at the construction of nationalism to see that here we have that old story, that it's states and large-scale economic change that are the two driving forces in the construction of national identities. Now, I've gone on, at least in 2 lectures and part of another one, talking about British national identity, and I'm certainly not going to go through that again, except to say that it was precociously early, the sense of being British. And I also argued along the line that we can now, at least for elites, say that French national identity began to be constructed in at least by the middle of the 18th century. But when you think of the real hot spots, the real trouble spots of the 20th century, when you think of the origins of World War I, which we will be doing Thinking Out Loud together over the next couple weeks, we will be considering Eastern Europe, Central Europe, and the Balkans. And what's important to understand, and here this is a reasonably decent transition from the initial discussion of this anthropologist's excellent book, is that in most of those places there was no sense of national identity, of being Slovene, of being Czech, of being Croat, of being Bulgarian, of being Ukrainian or Ruthenian, the two are essentially the same, until quite late in the 19th century. And so part of what's going on in Europe between, let's say, 1880s and 1914 is this incredible advancement, in quotes, if you want to call it that, in thinking with the emergence of national identity, of ethnic national identity, in that identities competing and demanding their own states in that part of the world. And of course, when in late June 1914, a 16-year-old heavily armed guy, Serb nationalist, I went to put my feet in the which no longer, my feet still exist, but the places, the steps in Sarajevo no longer exist because of all the bombing, and the place where Princip shot Archduke Francis Ferdinand, the assassination that led to, because of this, the sort of entangling alliances, diplomatic alliances that led to World War I, that he was someone who practically could not have existed in the middle of the 19th century, even though among Serb elites there was a national sense. And I'm going to give you some examples taken from Anderson of even the publication of the very first dictionaries in languages that we now, that now are quite common for us to identify with national states, with ethnic national states. But in fact, some of these states, some of these languages did not even have their own written dictionaries until the middle of the 19th century. And that's not so long ago. So nationalism has to be constructed. A sense of self-identity has to be constructed. And so that's kind of what I want to talk about. Now let me say something at the beginning, is that because of the French Revolution, and because of the development in Europe and in other places of parliamentary regimes and democracies, it's fairly common to think, well, national self-consciousness equals a desire for national states, and you can't have that with a monarchy. Well, that's not really true at all. I mean, that's influenced, for example, by the experience of the United States. Now, the United States, the 13 colonies, English was overwhelmingly the language of the 13 colonies, and they are rebelling in the 1776 and all of that against other English-speaking people who happened to have had a monarchy, and so no taxation without representation really became also a kind of an anti-monarchist sentiment. If you think of the Spanish. The rebellions in Latin America against Spain, there too, the rebellion, though there were millions of people of indigenous peoples who did not speak Spanish, but basically it was a rebellion of Spanish speakers against a monarch that was Spanish speaking in the case of Spain. But if you think about really extreme ethnic nationalism at the end of the 19th century, you think of two states who helped kind of push the world to the catastrophe that was World War I. One has to point the finger at both Russia and Germany, which had autocracies. And that the campaign, for example, this is jumping ahead a little bit, but just I'm providing you an overview, the campaign of Russification that was undertaken by the Russian czars, a brutal campaign against non-Russian minorities, was in part a response to rebellions within the Russian Empire by Poles, for example, who rise up in 1831 and in 1863 and are crushed like grapes. And in 1863, Bismarck, the Chancellor of Germany, congratulates the Tsar for stomping on the Polish insurgents. But the campaign of Russification was part of the reinvention of Russian national identity. And when I talked about Peter the Great, I talked about how he was, saw himself as this great Russian patriot. Well, the Russian aggressive Russian nationalism picks its targets rather systematically in campaigns of Russification. And the big pogrom, the massacres of Jews in Odessa, in Crimea and in other places, are cheered on by the Russian Tsar, by Nicholas II, whom I will talk about when I get to the Russian Revolution, who saw this as a healthy thing, that the Jews are being beaten to death by real Russians. And this was part of his campaign of Russification. In the case of Germany, you've got this sort of madcap loser, Wilhelm II, cracking bottles of champagne, or not of champagne, but of Riesling, as I said, over big, speedy battleships, powerful battleships, and all of that. And so nobody was more nationalist, aggressive nationalist than Wilhelm II, the Kaiser, who kept saying rather disingenuously that he was the #1 German, and all of that. So we can get rid of the idea that strong national identity necessarily has a parliamentary outcome. I mean, the case of Britain, well, we're not going to talk about Britain too much, but the case of Britain is pretty interesting too. But there you have a monarch without real power. But Victoria represents, in the imaginary of the British citizens, what the stability and really the constitutional settlement of the British Empire. But yet, a couple points need to be made. Is that language is important in all of this, and though not always. I mean, maybe if I have time, I'll give a Swiss example later on. But basically, in the case of Russian and German nationalism and French nationalism and even Spanish nationalism, because of the dominance of Castile, one looks back to the time when national languages which already existed, are used and become identified with this self-identity of national people. Now, Latin was the language. I mean, Latin was the language of science, of diplomacy, of everything. And it really, part of what's intriguing about the scientific revolution is and important about it is that the vernacular languages begin to be used as a way of communicating a scientific discovery. So there's a little bit in that chapter that you read about that. And certainly language is closely tied to national self-identity. And of course, one of the ways when nationalism is most aggressive and most vulgar is when very ordinary people, whipped on by elites, in some ways are urged on by elites, begin identifying people who don't speak the same language as somehow not part of this imagined community. An obvious example would be all the Hungarians who, after the Treaty of Versailles in 1919 and the subsequent treaties named after Paris suburbs, are included in Romania and are treated as outsiders. And this is very important even in the origins of the 1989 revolution that brought down the dreadful Ceausescu's dictators in Romania. But anyway, the vernacular develops if you exclude, the cases of Spanish, Latin America rebelling against Spain, and the Americans rebelling against the British. The development of these languages, and the use of the languages and their identity with this imagined community is obviously a very important part of this as well. And with the development of the concept of being a citizen, and this is why one of the many reasons the French Revolution is so important. That you're no longer the subject of the king, you're a citoyen, or if you're female, you're a citoyenne. Citizenship takes on this kind of linguistic aspect as well. During the French Revolution, there was a revolutionary priest called the Abbé Grégoire. I think I mentioned him in the book. And he thought that all of these regional languages should be squished like grapes because somehow they stood in the way of a true French national identity. The whole language, I mean, it's so terribly complicated because in the case of Italy, which is sort of in some ways a counterexample, I think I said before, but it's true that at the time of Italian unification, only about 4 or 5% of the population of Italy, of the whole boot, and Sicily, spoke what is now considered to be Italian. The case of France, which I know more about, is equally fascinating because at the time of the French Revolution, half the French population did not speak French. There was a lot of bilingualism, but they did not speak French. And if you imagine a map of France, and I think I went through this very quickly before, but if you imagine a map of France, and if you start at the top, they spoke Néerlandais or Dutch in Dunkirk and places like that. And if you move over to Alsace and much of Lorraine, they spoke German dialect there. And that would be a majority language until well after World War I. I mean, and how the French tried to get rid of the German is another story of sort of national aggression, even in the context of Germany's defeat after World War I. And then if you move further south, as you go to Savoie, which was, don't write this down, but Savoie was next to France in 1860, people spoke essentially Piedmontese, which is the language spoken in northern Italy, in the state, the strongest state of Italy, Piedmont, Sardinia. And then you go further down, and they spoke what? They spoke Provençal. Provençal, as in Jean de Florette and Manon Les Sources, and these Provençal poets sitting up at a place called Les Baux and freezing in the winds of the Mistral and reading each other Provençal poetry. Then you go to Languedoc, and they spoke Occitan, which is a language of Occ. I mean, it's a southern French language. It's a written language. You go to Catalonia, and they spoke Catalan. No surprise there. You go into the Basque country, and they spoke Basque, which is only remotely connected to Finnish and Magyar. That is, those are the three hardest languages in Europe. I mean, how they got there, that's another whole story. You know, we don't really know. If you go north, they spoke Gascon. If you go into Brittany, they spoke Breton, which has nothing to do with French at all, Breton. But even in places that didn't have languages, there were patois. And patois is a sort of denigrating term that says, well, they speak patois. In other words, they don't speak really French. But in central France, they spoke one patois. In the Limousin, they spoke another patois that was related to that one. Even in the Loire Valley, people spoke patois. So this did not condemn them to eternal backwardness. And one must say that in the construction of French national identity, that there was an argument a long time ago by my late friend Eugene Weber that said that all French national identity had to be constructed between 1880 and 1910 because of railroads, military conscription, and education. Railroads, military conscription, and education. It's easy to see how that would work. But in fact, I mean, he missed one of the complexity of this a glorious country is that that lots of Breton soldiers didn't learn French until they were in the trenches, if they were lucky enough to survive in World War I, and they still spoke Breton in the 1920s and 1930s. And there's still old ladies in Brittany that still speak Breton, and their command of French is a bit problematic. Or in Corsica, there still have many people who speak Corsican. They may or may not feel like they're French. So it's in bilingualism. I mean, just as a little aside, in the village where I spent half my life, actually almost in the last 25 years or so, people spoke patois and not French through the 1930s. And then that really sort of disappeared, and now older friends of ours understand patois, but they don't speak it. And I had something from a book as I did, and I needed someone to look at to make sure that what I'd written in patois was correct. Not that I wrote it, but I took from something. And my friend, my Boule partner, Lulu, his parents spoke that as their main language, but he couldn't correct it because it's just those languages are disappearing. But the point of all this is that now the more we know about national self-identity, it's possible to have more than one identity. And it's also just a leap of faith to say, oh, well, so-and-so, who are you? You ask who they are. Well, that they're going to say, well, I'm German or I'm French is going to be the first thing that they're going to say. They may say, I'm from this village or I'm from this family or I'm from this region or I'm Catholic or Protestant or Jewish or Muslim. Some response like that. But yet when we think of nationalism, we think of these languages as being motors for elites first and then ordinary people to demand states, that the borders of states be drawn in a way that reflects their ethnicity. And after World War I, in the Treaty of Versailles, you'd gone to war over the whole damn question of nationalism. All these millions of people get killed, dying in terrible ways, gas and everything else, flamethrowers and machine guns and all this stuff that we'll talk about. And so they say, well, geez, if we draw the lines around these peoples and give everybody a state, that'll be cool. And then we won't have wars anymore. So they get all these big maps and these map makers, and they try to draw these state boundaries after the collapse of the four empires. And it doesn't work. You can't do it. And then you've got winners and you've got losers. And so if you're going to punish the losers, like Hungary, then you leave Hungary, this sort of small country, with much of its population living on the other side of borders, and either imagining that should still be part of Hungary, or wanting themselves to live back in Hungary, where there'd be nothing for them at all. But yet, the period we're talking about, and the period that I began with, you've got this mobilization of elites saying, holy cow, we need our own state. And remember, a line I already gave you a lecture or two ago, all these Czechs sitting in 1848 in a room like this, and not quite as nice, and they say, geez, if the ceiling falls in, that's the end of the Czech national movement. But between 1848, the springtime of the peoples, and 1914, you have millions of people who, a couple decades before that, had absolutely no sense of being Slovene, or very little sense of being Slovene or Slovak, or Croat, or whatever, who are suddenly making national demands and wanting to have a separate state within the context, for example, or to be independent from the Austro-Hungarian Empire. And one of those people was the 16-year-old boy, Princip, who blows the brains out of Franz Ferdinand and his wife when this car backs up the wrong street in Sarajevo. Though some of his friends were out there trying to get him too. So that's just a way of kind of thinking about about that stuff. Now, okay, let me give you a couple examples here. I wrote down Ukraine. Ukraine is a huge country, huge, important country. Very contested relationship with Russia now because of having got Crimea, and Russia wants to have Crimea, and all of this highly contested relationship because of the number of Russians who live in Ukraine, and all of that. And for Ukrainians, the sense that Ukraine always existed is always taken as a given. The first Ukrainian grammar book, and this is not dissing Ukrainians or anybody, but I'm just saying that the reality is that the first Ukrainian grammar book was published not in 1311, or in 1511, but in 1819 is the very first one. The first Czech-German dictionary, if you're going to have a national identity, you've got to have a dictionary so you can translate things between German and Czech, is published, it's a long publication process, 1935 to 1939, A to Z. The first Czech national organization, the one I just described, starts in 1846. Now that's pretty recent. The first Norwegian grammar book, which has distinguished Norwegian as a separate language and a separate identity from, say, Swedish and Danish, is not till 1848, grammar book, and the first dictionary that is separating, making a distinction between Norwegian and Danish isn't until 1850. And that's what I mean about about the construction of national identity, is that you have to have that you have to have a sense that you are part of this imagined community. Now, having said that, before I talk about a counterexample, yes, let me do this like that. Why not? Let me give you a couple examples that I hope make the point, and these I'm drawing from Snyder. That let's look at why, at the end of the 19th century, Lithuanian nationalism develops. Lithuania, Lithuania, capital Vilnius. Big, tall basketball players like Sabonis, who played in the NBA. That why Lithuanian nationalism rapidly develops, but only at the end of the 19th century, and Belarusian nationalism doesn't develop at all until way in well, it's even pushing it to say in the 20s and 30s. Now there's this huge Belarusian. I was, in Poland. The various times I go to Poland, there was a huge dinner with all these Belarusians, who most of them were dissidents and are there to discuss the history of Belarusia. But none of them were going to be claiming that Belarusia had an identity, had a self-identity before the 1930s. But Lithuania existed. Lithuania was part of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, which exists basically until the last partition of Poland in 1795, when Poland gets munched, bouffé, by the great powers. So who do these people think they were? Well, they think they're Polish. They consider themselves Polish. And Poles already had a basis for nationalism. They had a written language. They have heroes. Chopin, there's one. Chopin didn't go to Paris, by the way, as a refugee from Russian repression. He went there to further his musical career. But anyway, he wrote lots that had to do with Polish national themes, folklore, and all of that. And so there were dukes. There had been dukes of Lithuania, grand dukes. But they never published, they didn't accept Lithuanian as a language, and if they wanted to get anywhere, they tried to pass themselves off as Poles. Pilsudski, a name you'll come back to, who destroyed the Polish Republic as one after another of European states goes authoritarian in the 1920s and 30s. Pilsudski, who was the hero of the miracle of the Vistula River when the Polish army turns back the Red Army, at the end of World War I, in just sort of amazing, moment. Pilsudski himself, was the son, considered himself, he was Lithuanian, but he considered himself Polish. He was absolutely a Lithuanian. But yet there was a Lithuanian language, but it was not spoken by the elites. So who spoke the Lithuanian language? It was spoken by the peasants. So at the end of the 19th century, you suddenly got all these intellectuals, these Lithuanian intellectuals, and grand dukes, and priests, and various people saying, wait a minute, we are Lithuanians, and happily the Lithuanian peasantry has saved our language. From the last Lithuanian duke who spoke Lithuanian died before Columbus discovered America, Tim Snyder informed me. So suddenly they say, oh, baby, these Lithuanian peasants, instead of just being, we won't treat them anymore as the scum of the earth, they have preserved our language for us. And suddenly you have poets writing in Lithuanian. And it's no longer a disgrace to be seen as a Lithuanian. There was one of these poets, a guy called Kudirka, who died in 1899. He recalled when he was in school, as a Lithuanian kid, a smart Lithuanian kid, he says, my self-preservation instinct told me not to speak in Lithuanian, and to make sure that no one noticed that my father wore a rough peasant's coat and could only speak Lithuanian. I did my best to speak Polish, even though I spoke it badly. Polish is a terribly difficult language. There's all these sort of squiggly things that you just, things don't pronounce like it's supposed to, but you think they're supposed to be. And I don't do very well at picking up Polish. But when my father and other relatives visited me, I stayed away from them when I could see that fellow students or gentlemen were watching. He was embarrassed to be basically Lithuanian and the son of a Lithuanian peasant. I only spoke with them at ease when we were alone or outside. I saw myself as a Pole, and thus as a gentleman, I had imbibed the Polish spirit. But it's only, by the end of the century, he sees himself as a Lithuanian, and he is one of these people who is pushing Lithuanian nationalism, and it is embraced. Now, how does this physically happen? I mean, how do you don't wake up and say, oh, boy, I was Polish yesterday, and subject of the Tsar, because Poland is divided between Prussia, Austria-Hungary, and Russia. But if you were in the Russian part of what they called Congress Poland, then suddenly today I'm Lithuanian. How does that happen? Well, because Lithuania is next to Germany. And this is also something that will make you again think of what I said about the Enlightenment, is that lots of literature is smuggled into Lithuania, in Lithuanian. And so therefore, there's this wild profusion of Lithuanian literature that comes into that comes into Lithuania, which, of course, as you know, was not independent. It's part of the Russian Empire. And so there's another reason, too, which is for the Russian imperial secret police, the ones that they're really worried about, they're worried about the Poles, because the Poles, after all, have been risen up in 1831 and in 1863. And so they're on the lookout for people that are saying, hey, I'm Polish, we want a Polish state. And they don't pay much attention, they don't really care about these Lithuanians who are discovering their own self-identity, who are constructing their self-identity. Now, why doesn't it happen in Belarus? I don't have time to tell you very much about this, but the main thing is that Belarus is a long way from anywhere at the time. There isn't any kind of elite in Russia that embraces Belarusian anything. And so the language is not seen part of a national self-identity that basically does not exist and would not exist until at least after World War I. And now, you know, Lithuanians will look back on their country as if Lithuania had always had this sort of self-identity, but you know, it was part of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, and that was more basically a Polish operation than it was a territorial thing more than any kind of construction of two peoples participating in this this thing. Furthermore, you know, Belarusians were not allowed to publish in Belarusian, and where Lithuanian priests begin giving sermons in Lithuanian, and you've got all this sort of written material coming in the vernacular. Nobody read Belarusian in church. There were no priests to say that this is our language, and Belarusians who were literate could read Polish or Russian or both, but in many cases not what would become Belarusian at all. And so by the end of the 19th century, when you've got these other people insisting that we're Slovenes and we're this and that, Belarusian speakers called themselves Russian if they were Orthodox. They called themselves, that is, Orthodox religion. They called themselves Polish if they were Roman Catholic. And if they were simply looking out for themselves, they just called themselves local. They said, we live in the Russian Empire, and that's who we are. There was no sense of being Belarusian. So there are different outcomes in all of this stuff. Now, having said that, we're going to get there. We're going to get there. Let me give you another example. I want to find this date that'll make you at least realize that you can have a national identity and have more than one language. It's very complex. I guess the most interesting case now would be Belgium, which I don't have a lot of time to talk about. But in Belgium, I have a friend who works in the Belgian Ministry of Culture in Brussels. And about 7 years ago, I asked him, I said, do you think Belgium will exist in 10 years? And he said, I hope not. This guy works for the Belgian Ministry of Culture. And this reflects the sharp antagonism between the Flemish, who basically live in the north and east, but above all the northern parts of Belgium, and who are more prosperous and who are more numerous, about, say, 55% of the population, and their tensions with the Walloons, that is the French speakers, you know, Liège and Arlon and all those places, and then also in Brussels, which is technically part of the Flemish zone, but because of the bureaucracy and because Brussels is the most important city, has become this sort of third place, hotly contested by the Flemish, and real serious tensions there. If you ask in French, you know, what time the train is to Bruges, you know, they're not going to reply, and they know perfectly well. They just simply won't reply and pretend not all of them. But there's a serious tensions that are compounded also by the fact that there tends to be, not everybody, but the far right is really tied to Flemish self-identity. And the Walloons, that is the French, many of whom want to be attached to, the French speakers want to be attached to France, see their lives as very different. Also, that the Walloon part of Belgium is basically the Rust Belt, and that the Flemish part is very, very prosperous. in comparison. But yet, Belgium, which didn't exist till 1831, legally didn't exist. The revolution in 1830 and 31 is still there. By the way, there's also 5% tacked on after Versailles around a town called Eupen who speak German. But anyway, there we go. But Belgium is still there, and it's possible when I'm in Belgium, which I am frequently, I think now this is really Europe because of the complexity of it. And so you can have a national identity without having a single dominant language if the two sides are tolerant. Well, let me give you another quick example, and then we got to rock and roll onto the AH Empire. See, we're a shortcut now, not Austria-Hungary, but I got to save time, so AH Empire. But what about Switzerland? Here you've got Switzerland. What is it? If I remember correctly, the statistics, I think the French population, speaking French population, is 22%. German-speaking or Swiss Deutsch speaking population is about maybe 71% or something like that. You've got an Italian-speaking population of about 5%. You also have another language called Romanesque, which is spoken only by a few 100,000 people. And so that's 1, 2, 3 languages already, plus English, because of the international role of Geneva, is the fourth major language, fourth recognized language in Switzerland. But Switzerland, if you think of Switzerland now is so prosperous and it's full of chocolate and full of banks and full of watches and all of that. And you think everybody yodeling and cows running around and everybody's very happy and eating perch out of the lakes. But Swiss have to create this sort of sense that they have always been a nation. But of course they haven't. Switzerland, the decentralized federalist nature of Switzerland was always there. During the Reformation, to say somebody was turning Swiss meant that they were rejecting the demands of their lords, and rejecting the religion imposed by their lords, and turning to Protestantism if they were in a Catholic area, or to Catholicism if they were in a Protestant area. And the Swiss were big-time mercenaries, and big-time farmers. But Switzerland fought its last war early in the 19th century and has been neutral. And it's a very complicated story what happened in Switzerland during World War II. It's very tragic. The Swiss did not, they turned so many Jews back at the frontier and sent them back to Germany and laundering Nazi money and all that. I'm not dumping on the Swiss, but it's a complicated story in the case of their neutrality. But so they decided in 1891, on the 600th anniversary of the Swiss Confederation, that Switzerland began in 1291. That a bunch of people got together between all the cows and eating chocolate and all that stuff, and that they announced that they were Switzerland. And so here's again what I mean, what Anderson means about this sort of imagined community, that you're inventing a kind of date that you said, well, we've been like that since then, and that's all there is to it. But if you've got all these different languages, and the languages are not as far apart as French and Dutch, well, in a way they are, because Dutch is really, well, Dutch would not see it that way, but it's a German dialect. But nonetheless, the Swiss are a lot better at learning each other's language than the French speakers certainly are at learning Dutch, which they view as impossible and they don't like having their kids having to learn it in school and all that. It's terribly complicated. But so they imagine this community, but it exists. I mean, Switzerland exists. People have a sense of being Swiss despite these different languages. They're not the disparities, economic disparities that there are between urban and rural life, but nothing like the disparity between the Flemish parts of Belgium and the French parts of Belgium, if you exclude Brussels, and all that. Now, but let me end in the last 5 minutes and 7 seconds that is allotted to me. Let me end with the counterexample, which you can read about. And I said at the beginning, inspired by the sheer horror of the Balkans, and some of you aren't old enough to remember, certainly not, my God, I am, all the stuff that happened in the 90s, but you are, the late 90s, you can probably remember all the massacres and stuff like that. And I said at the very beginning of the hour, or the beginning of the 50 minutes, that people now tend to look longingly back and they say, geez, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, it sure lasted a long time. You had 15 major nationalities. It was kind of a balancing act. You've got becomes the dual monarchy in 1867, where the Hungarians have more or less equal rights. You've got Austria and you've got Hungary, but you've got another 13 peoples, at least 13 peoples, living within the empire. You've got the Croats, who have their own nobility, and they're kind of given favored status so that they can, so this whole thing is sort of balanced like that. But how does the place stay together? How does Austria-Hungary stay together? I end one of those chapters, that chapter with this very famous scene from the Parliament in Vienna, where you've got these different ethnic groups playing drums and singing songs and trying to disrupt the speeches by people from the other nationalities, and you've got all these problems with the South Slavs wanting at least minimal representation as sort of this third state, in quotes, along with Austria and Hungary. How does the thing stay together? Well, basically in this way. I'm just telling you briefly about things that you can read about, but I just wanted to make some sense of it. First of all, is that the empire, the language of the empire is German. And to get somewhere in the Austro-Hungarian Empire, you need to know German. And so learning German becomes a kind of a social mobility, the way that learning French becomes for somebody from Gascony a form of social mobility. You can get a job in the bureaucracy. If you're going to have a huge, old, humongous empire, going all the way to the rugged terrain of Bosnia and Herzegovina, you got to have officials in their little hats and their little desks who are going to be running all this stuff. And you've got to have a language. And so the language of the empire is German. And so this does not mean that people feel that they're German. I mean, after all, they're not German. They're German speakers within the Austro-Hungarian Empire. But it gives them an allegiance to this apparatus. Secondly, the middle class. The middle class is German. Largely German, except in Budapest, where it's Hungarian. But still, many Germans live in Budapest as well. And one of the things that I wish I had time to talk about, but you can't talk about everything, is that what you've got in these cities, and I mentioned this just in reference the other day, cities of all of Eastern Europe and Central Europe, you have kind of an ethnization of these cities. Because all of the cities, whether you're talking about Budapest or you're talking about Warsaw or anywhere you're talking about, have, or even Vilnius, you have large German populations and also large Jewish populations. And in the course of the last decades of the 19th century, you have this sort of arrival of peasants, Estonian peasants into Tallinn, of Czech peasants into Prague, of Hungarian peasants into Budapest, of Lithuanian peasants into Vilnius, etc., etc. But you still got, in the Austro-Hungarian case, you still have, even in Budapest, you still have a large middle class that is fundamentally German and believes in the empire. Next, you've got dynastic loyalty. You've got this old dude, Franz Joseph, who had been there since 1848. He lives till 1916, the same guy. And that makes Victoria seem like she had a short reign. And people have an allegiance to this dynasty. I mean, the Habsburg dynasty had been dominant in Central Europe until they contest the Prussians and lose out, in the War of 1866. So you've got this Franz Joseph. Also, you've got the church. You've got the Catholic Church. Now, there are lots of Protestants. For example, in the Czech lands, in Bohemia, whereas Slovakia is almost overwhelmingly Catholic in what would become Czechoslovakia and then divorce amicably enough in 1993. And Croatia is overwhelmingly Catholic, aggressively so. And so despite the fact you have these huge Muslim enclaves in the old, what had been the Ottoman Empire, you still have this church is a unifying force, not for everybody, certainly not for the Jews, not for the Gypsies, who are the Roma, who are very many there, and not for Protestants, and not for Orthodox Serbs, which is part of the tensions there as well, because they saw Russia as being their protector. You can read more about that, but that's another thing. And finally, you've got the army. The army is a form of social promotion as well. The army doesn't have the bad reputation that the French army did for shooting down young girls protesting, young women protesting in strikes. It doesn't have the reputation that the brutal Guardia Civil did in Spain. The army is seen as a useful way of representing the empire. It has a good reputation. And German, the language German, is the language of command. And so these soldiers and the soldiers are drawn from all of these nationalities, they at least have that in common. So to conclude, the most important question to ask about this empire, particularly in reference to what I've been saying about this whole hour, is to not look at why it came apart, but to look at how it held together so long. And given the horrors perpetuated on Europe by aggressive nationalism from then and even before, as during the French Revolution, to this very day, sometimes, and I never thought I'd ever say this about me, looking nostalgically back to an empire, but it is an interesting and at least food for thought. So on that note, bon appetit, and to see you on Wednesday.